This is section 4.4, part B, graphing sine and cosine functions. Now, as a refresher from the last section that we looked at, when you're graphing a sine function, if it's just the sine of x, this means that it has an amplitude 1, and it's going to change at an interval of pi over 2. So we start at 0, 0, and every pi over 2 it changes. So it'll go to the high point, then the next pi over 2 it goes to the middle, next pi over 2 it's the low point, and then the next pi over 2 again it is back at the middle. For cosine, instead of starting at 0, 0, it starts at its high point at 0, 1. It will also change every pi over 2 for its interval. So after pi over 2 it's at the middle, the next pi over 2 it's at the low point, the next pi over 2 it's at the middle again, and then the next pi over 2 it is back at its high point. Now the equations for sine and cosine, the equation for sine is y is equal to a times the sine of bx plus c plus d, and cosine is a times the cosine of bx plus c plus d. Now remember that a value is telling you about your amplitude. And that tells you how far above or below that midline your graph will go. The b value is used to determine the period of your function, and the period of your function is 2 pi over the absolute value of b. Now that tells you how far between 2 points that are the same on the graph. So the distance between a high point and a high point is the length of one period. Frequency in a sinusoidal function is the number of cycles that a function completes in 1 unit interval. So in 1 whole unit, so from here to 1 unit away, how many times does the graph go up and down? Frequency is just the reciprocal of the period, so it's just the absolute value of b over 2 pi. Music notes are classified by frequency. In the equal tempered scale, middle C has a frequency of 262 Hertz and an amplitude of 0.2. Write an equation for a sine function that could be used to model the initial behavior of the sound wave. Now remember, sine is a times the sine of bx plus c plus d. They tell us that the frequency is 262 Hertz, and we know that frequency is the absolute value of b over 2 pi. To get the b value by itself, we can multiply both sides by 2 pi, and it will get us that b is either plus or minus 524 pi. Now for the purpose of this equation, let's let it be the positive. They tell us that the amplitude, or the a value, is 0.2. So our equation can be 0.2 sine of 524 pi x. Now it is possible that we take our graph and we shift it to the left or to the right. When you do this horizontal translation, we call this the phase shift. To find the phase shift, you're going to do negative c over the absolute value of b. So for this function, we need to state the amplitude, the period, the frequency, and the phase shift. Remember, the amplitude is whatever value is right in front of your sine or your cosine. So in this case, this value, a is 1, b is 3, and c is negative pi over 2. To find your amplitude, your amplitude is just your a value, so our amplitude in this case will be 1. To find your period, it is 2 pi over the absolute value of b, or in this case it's going to be 2 pi over 3. Your frequency is just the reciprocal of that, so it's just the absolute value of b over 2 pi, which is just going to be 3 over 2 pi. And our phase shift is negative c over the absolute value of b. So in this case, it's going to be negative pi over 2 all over 3. Negative and negative makes that positive. So this is going to be pi over 2 times 3 is the same thing as 3 over 1. When you have a fraction over fraction, remember you flip the second and you multiply. So our phase shift is going to be pi over 6. Now we also need to find your interval to see how frequently we need to change. And remember from last time I said that the frequency is the period over 4. Our period is 2 pi over 3. And if we divide that by 4, that's going to give us 2 pi over 3 times 1/4. Or it's going to give us 2 pi over 12, which can be reduced to pi over 6. So this tells us every pi over 6, our graph is going to be changing. So since we're dealing with 6 here and with our phase shift, let's go ahead and make our scale as pi over 6. So this will be 2 pi over 6 or pi over 3. This will be 3 pi over 6 or pi over 2. 4 pi over 6 or 2 pi over 3. 5 pi over 6 cannot reduce. And 6 pi over 6 will just be pi. We would have the same scale to the left. It will just be negative. Now, this is the sine function. We do know that my amplitude is just going to be 1. Since it is the sine function, normally it should start at 0, 0. But our phase shift tells us we need to start by shifting over our first point, should start at pi over 6 instead of 0. Now our interval, sorry, our phase shift was up here, but it's still pi over 6. Our interval tells us every pi over 6 after that, it should change. So the first pi over 6 after that is when we reach our high point. Next pi over 6 is middle. Next pi over 6 is low. Back to middle, high, back to middle. Since we were at middle, we're going to be low, middle, high, middle, low, middle, high, back to middle. And then you will just draw your graph. So it goes through those points. Now we can also have a vertical shift. This is a shift that's going to shift it up or down. If that value of d is greater than 0, it will shift your graph up. If the value of d is less than 0, it will shift the graph down. Now, I keep talking about the midpoint or the midline. The midline is the point in which the graph is oscillating. So originally, our graph was oscillating around the value of y is equal to 0. If we are shifting our graph up or down, we are also going to have to shift our midline. So again, we need to state our amplitude, period, frequency, phase shift, and then we're going to state vertical shift. It should also be in your best interest to find your interval before we start graphing. So the a value is whatever's right in front of sine, which in this case will be 1. Our b value is whatever's right in front of x, which is 1. Our c value is whatever you are adding or subtracting from the x, so 2 pi. And your d value is whatever you're adding or subtracting after the parentheses, which will be -1. To find the amplitude, remember the amplitude is just your a value. And in this case, that will be 1. So that means once you find your midline, your graph will go up 1 unit above and 1 unit below. Our period is 2 pi over the absolute value of b, which in this case will be 2 pi over 1, or just 2 pi. Frequency is absolute value of b over 2 pi, or 1 over 2 pi. And let's go ahead and find our interval. Your interval is period over 4, or 2 pi over 4, which will be pi over 2, which remember tells us every pi over 2 something will change. It'll go from a high to a low to a middle to then back to a low on the next one. To find our phase shift, we're going to do negative c over the absolute value of b. This time it's going to be negative 2 pi over 1, or just negative 2 pi. And your vertical shift is just whatever that d value is, which in this case will be negative 1. So the first thing you would do would be to scale your graph. So let's do 1, 2, negative 1, negative 2. And then you need to place your midline. Now it tells us we're going to shift down to negative 1. So instead of oscillating around the y-axis, we are now going to oscillate around the line of y equals negative 1. Now our amplitude is still 1, so we're still going to go 1 unit above that and 1 unit below it. Because this is sine, we would normally start at 0 on that line, but we have a phase shift of negative 2 pi. So instead of starting at 0, negative 1, we're going to start on our line at negative 2. Our interval is pi over 2, so we're still changing every pi over 2. So pi over 2 away, we're going to go 1 unit above the line. Pi over 2 units away, we're back to the line. Below the line, on the midline, up, midline, down, midline. From here, you would just draw your graph. So to summarize, remember the graph, our equations are given. The amplitude is just the absolute value of A. Period is 2 pi over the absolute value of B. Frequency is the absolute value of B over 2 pi. The phase shift is negative c over the absolute value of B. The vertical shift is just the value of D. Your midline will be located at y equals D. And the interval in which the graph is changing is period over 4.